Hi, we're going to discuss intelligence. We'll start off with what is intelligence, then we'll look at individual differences and group differences, and then in the next video we will look at stereotype threat and mindset. Here's how I'd like you to begin. I'm going to show you some questions that come from a World War I intelligence test that was used for Army recruitment. Take a look at the questions and then think about how did you do and why, and then think more broadly. What is intelligence? Can a person be smart in some ways and not others? And can you think of any examples? And what is the difference between intelligence and achievement? So I'm going to show you those questions. Press pause, reflect for a few minutes, and when you're ready to begin again, press play. Okay, so how did you do? Well, probably not so well. And why do you think that is? Well, you're probably thinking it's asking you about information that you may or may not have been exposed to. Okay? So if you're feeling like this isn't really tapping into your intelligence, then what do you think intelligence is? Okay, so we will address that question on the next slide. We will also address, can a person be smart in some ways and not others? And we'll give some examples of that. And in our next video, we will look at achievement. Okay? So intelligence refers to individual differences in the ability to learn, process, remember, and use new information. It refers to your ability to solve problems and engage in reasoning. Intelligence is an abstract construct. What that means is that there is not a thermometer to measure intelligence. There is not a measuring tape that can measure intelligence. It's abstract, okay? It's also a social construct, meaning that there's some variation from culture to culture in terms of what is valued and emphasized with respect to intelligence. So there are many different models of intelligence that have emerged over the years, and some of them focus on a single intelligence, others focus on multiple intelligences. A model that does a good job of summarizing all of that into a single model is Carroll's model. And what you can see here is that there are 3 layers of intelligence. Up at the top is the most general, and then it gets more specific as you move toward the bottom. All right, so G, just the letter G, refers to general intelligence. And that is referring to a general mental capacity that cuts across different kinds of situations and information. Okay, but then you can break that down into some different pieces. And there are multiple pieces, both at level 2 and down at the very bottom. I'm just going to mention 2 of these, fluid versus crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence refers to the ability to reason and solve problems in new situations, whereas crystallized intelligence refers to the ability to use your knowledge that was acquired through experience. Okay, so fluid is about the more abstract ability to reason and solve problems in these new situations. Crystallized is more about the actual knowledge that you have. Fluid intelligence peaks earlier in development, and crystallized intelligence is going to peak later in adulthood. Okay, so you can see that these are 2 of many different specific types of intelligence. Okay. So how do we assess those individual differences? Well, assessment involves generation of a score called IQ. And as I said a moment ago, intelligence is an abstract construct. You can't see it or touch it or directly measure it. And so IQ is a score for intelligence, but it is not the same thing as intelligence. So IQ scores can be influenced by factors other than intelligence. format of an IQ test involves several different pieces, and these are the same kinds of issues you would encounter for a personality test or some other kind of test. But in terms of format, there's the standardization, reliability, and validity. Standardization is about sameness. So sameness in content and in procedure and in scoring. And when a test is standardized, then you can give it to a group of people. And when they get their scores, those scores have meaning. They can be compared to a set of norms that determine what is average, what is higher and lower than the average. And if you look at this graph here, you can see that for IQ, the average score is 100, and then those scores make a bell curve. And so there's the scores that get higher than 100 and lower than 100, but most of them are going to fall between 85 and 115. Then there's another segment that's a little below that or a little above that, and then very few really at the tails, okay? But the idea is you can get an IQ score and then place yourself onto this bell curve, okay? Reliability is about consistency. So for example, if the assumption is correct that with intelligence you're measuring something that is stable, then if you measure it at multiple times, you should get approximately the same scores. Validity means that you're measuring what you intend to measure. So if you intend to measure intelligence or some specific facet of intelligence, then you're actually measuring that. You're not tapping into cultural bias. You're not tapping into just general knowledge skills or something else. Okay, so validity means you're measuring what you intend to measure. And the goal of testing is to identify something, including, especially in the school setting, giftedness or disabilities, because the idea is that by identifying individuals who are at the tails of the bell curve, you can better tailor instruction to what they need, okay? So most people, it doesn't matter. Most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle range, but once you get to the tails, then there do start to be some special needs, both at the low end and at the high end. Testing can also be used to make predictions related to school performance or career, okay? So where do these individual differences come from? Well, it's going to be both nature and nurture. When it comes to individual differences in intelligence, genetics do play an important role, and we know that from both twin studies and adoption studies. And so if you look at this graph here, you can see different relationships and then looking at the percent IQ correlation. So identical twins that are raised apart, and so they share 100% of their genes, but they're raised apart, so they didn't share an environment, they still have well over 70% match in IQ. And as you have fewer genes shared, you get lower and lower correlations in intelligence, okay? But nurture matters too, because we can see that there are changes in IQ in a stimulating home. There's changes in IQ related to interventions like Head Start and so forth. Okay. But as I said, it's absolutely an interaction between the two. Okay, so this is looking at individual differences, one person compared to another person. But there's also group differences, and one of the things that we know is that there are persistent achievement gaps between groups. And very typically what we're talking about here are racially identified groups. And that is what it is. Data is what data is. So you give the same test to different groups of people, and then you either identify differences, group differences in scores, or you don't. Okay, so the data is the data. But the question is why? Why would there be group differences? And just to be very clear, the group differences that are typically talked about both in research and in politics are white and Asian American students, or people generally, but I'll refer to students, scoring higher than Black and Latino students. Okay? So that is the data, but how do we explain that? Well, one perspective looks at genetics. Now, I don't mean genetics the way we just talked about it with individual differences. Here, the argument is that some groups, on average, have more smart genes than other groups. Okay? So this is applying genetics at a group level. But this doesn't work so well. It does explain individuals, right? We just talked about that. But genetics is not a great way to explain group differences. Sociology gives us a tremendous amount of important information to understand group differences. Sociology is going to refer to big systems, sets of resources that are available to some groups and not other groups. So sociology is going to look at poverty and prejudice and other kinds of big picture issues to show how there's unequal soil. And so if you look at this image here, what you have are seeds. So imagine you have a bag of diverse seeds, and you grab a handful of those seeds and you put them in one pot, and then you grab another handful of seeds and you put them in another pot. These seeds are genetically diverse. Okay, so some are predisposed to get taller than others when they grow into plants. Now here's the difference. One of those pots has normal soil, the other has deficient soil. And what do you see? Well, in the normal soil, that genetically diverse handful of seeds was able to reach their potential. Some were taller than others, but they were able to grow up to the potential that was set genetically for them. Whereas in the deficient soil, it was that same genetic variety, and yet you see that there's stunting. Okay, so sociology is getting about this unequal soil, so to speak. Psychology adds to that sociological perspective by looking at cognitive sorts of issues that may be impacting performance in addition to the unequal soil. So stereotype threat and mindset, and we will look at those in the next video. Okay, thank you. Hi, we're going to continue discussing intelligence. In our last video, we talked about what is intelligence, individual differences, and group differences. In this video, we will talk about stereotype threat and mindset. I'm going to show you a quick video. As you're watching, be thinking, what is stereotype threat? Who does it affect? How is it demonstrated in the golf task? And how was it first informally demonstrated with third graders?
Are men better than women in science? Are certain races smarter? Those are the stereotypes, but now some psychologists say stereotypes can become self-fulfilling prophecies.
What's the ratio here of cute guys to, like, me?
Ever see this ad depicting a ditzy woman trying to get into college?
What are your plans for the future?
Like, when are the homecoming queen elections?
One study showed that women who watched ads like this before taking a math test scored 38% lower than women who didn't see the ad. The Kaplan Education and Test Prep Company helped us run similar tests. And sure enough, in our unscientific test, the women who saw the sexist commercials did worse. Some later told us they found those results hard to believe. It's so powerful that just watching the dumb ad could make a difference?
No.
I don't think so.
The women in your group did worse.
The only way for it to work is that you have to internalize it.
I guess you don't know what's really affecting you, which is creepy in and of itself.
This stereotype effect has been found in study after study, says NYU psychology professor Joshua Aronson.
We found that just reminding the women that they were college students at a selective college overcame the gender gap. However, when we remind them that they're women, the gap widens.
You tell Asians that, remember, Asians do well in math?
Yes.
Their scores go up?
Yes.
Then what does the stereotype that blacks test poorly do to a black person who's about to take a test?
The situation of taking an IQ test for a black kid is so loaded that it's not a direct measure of their intelligence.
He found he could change blacks' test scores simply by saying different things before the test.
Tell people taking that test that this isn't a test at all, it's a puzzle. The black students' scores jump dramatically. Mindset matters.
That was also found in golf experiments, as demonstrated here, done by Jeff Stone at the University of Arizona.
The test is designed to measure personal factors correlated with natural athletic ability.
First, black and white students are told a miniature golf game tests athletic ability.
Natural athletic ability. Natural athletic ability.
After hearing that, blacks perform better. Blacks, after all, have heard plenty about blacks being natural athletes.
I'm confident in my ability, so when I heard it was a test of that, I was like, okay, well, I know I'm going to score somewhere in the high range to see how high I can go with this.
Oh! But when students were told the golf game is a test of intelligence,
The test is designed to measure personal factors correlated with sports intelligence.
his study found the black scores were 18% worse.
Oh, come on.
Some of this research showing that stereotypes can become self-fulfilling prophecies was inspired by Jane Elliott's surprising experience.
It might be interesting to judge people today by the color of their eyes. Would you like to try this? Yeah!
Almost 40 years ago, this Iowa schoolteacher decided she'd show the kids what it was like to live with discrimination. So she divided her classes by eye color. ABC happened to be there to film one of her tests.
I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people.
She had the so-called inferior brown-eyed group wear these identifying collars. She told them they were lazy and slow and they'd have shorter recess.
Brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground.
The kids' behavior soon changed. Brown-eyed kids were miserable. The next day, she reversed the roles.
Yesterday, I told you that brown-eyed people aren't as good as blue-eyed people. That wasn't true. The truth is that brown-eyed people are better than blue-eyed people.
Then she gave them a flashcard test.
Okay, you want to be timed this morning? Yeah!
After the brown-eyed kids had been labeled inferior, it took them 5 minutes to finish the flashcards. But the next day, when they were the superior group, they finished in half the time.
I had no idea that you could change a child's academic performance. It never occurred to me that that would really work. On the day the kids were on the top, their academic performance was better than it had ever been before in my classroom.
You went faster than I ever had anyone go through the card test.
When you're told you're superior, you act up to that.
But the children she'd treated as inferior that day did much worse.
I set them up to fail, and they failed.
4 minutes and 18 seconds. I know we weren't going to make it. How long did it take you yesterday? 3 minutes.
The inferior group of kids seemed deeply affected by the day's test.
I said, "Do you want to take these collars off?" And she said, "It wouldn't make any difference." And I said, "Why? What do you mean?" She said, "We'll still have these eyes." Honey?
Okay, so what is stereotype threat? Well, we're talking about a situation involving a member of a group with a negative stereotype related to the task at hand. And what can happen is that there can be this fear of confirming negative expectations that doesn't have to be conscious. This can be totally unconscious. But there's this fear of living up to those negative expectations. And that fear disrupts working memory. In other words, it takes up space on that mental work table, leaving less room for actually doing the task. And the result is performing worse on the task. So you saw examples in the video of women performing worse on math tasks when they were reminded that they were women. But when they were reminded that they were women at a selective college, then they did better. Okay? In the golf task, the African American participants did better when they were told it was a test of natural athletic ability than they did when they were told it was a test of sports intelligence. Same task, but different performance depending on what kind of stereotype was being triggered. With the third graders, this is a classic demonstration. totally informal classroom demonstration done by Jane Elliott in the late 1960s, but repeated forward from there. And what happened is Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and there she was as a third grade teacher in rural Iowa with a bunch of white kids who had no basis for understanding what had happened. And she wanted to help them understand discrimination, and so she developed a procedure where she divided them by eye color. And on the first day, the blue-eyed kids were on top, the brown-eyed kids were on bottom, and then she flipped it the next day, and she found, much to her surprise, that this actually affected their academic performance. So on the day that kids were on top, they performed better than the kids on bottom. And then when she switched it, those same kids who had been on top the day before performed worse. All right? So now imagine this in the real world, where the kids who are on top or on bottom are the same every day, day in and day out, over the course of their education. So if stereotypes have a negative expectation for you in kindergarten and first grade, that carries through. So think about the powerful effect that that can have on long-term performance. Okay, and this little graph here is just depicting results from a study that was part of a set of studies, the original ones on stereotype threat. And what it's showing is that for a standardized kind of academic test, when participants were asked to fill in a bubble on the test that identified their race, it's the only independent variable, the only difference between the stereotype threat group and the no stereotype group. The ones that filled in that bubble identifying their race, you can see what happened to the black participants. They did much worse than when they did the same test, but without having to fill in that bubble. So simply being reminded of their race was enough to lower performance. That has nothing to do with unequal resources in schools. That has nothing to do with safety in neighborhoods or anything like that. This is about triggering stereotypes, okay? I'd like you to reflect for a moment, and we're going to shift into thinking about mindset. So I want you to take a look at these items and then calculate your score. Press pause, and when you're ready to begin again, press play. Okay, so lower scores represent a stronger growth mindset, and higher scores represent a stronger fixed mindset. So let's take a look at what those are. A fixed mindset with respect to intelligence is the belief that intelligence is static. It doesn't change. It's innate. And that leads to a desire to look smart and therefore a tendency to avoid challenges, give up easily due to obstacles, see effort as fruitless, ignore useful feedback, and be threatened by others' success. On the other hand, a growth mindset is the belief that intelligence can be developed. It leads to a desire to learn and therefore a tendency to embrace challenges, persist despite obstacles, see effort as a path to mastery, learn from criticism, and be inspired by others' success. I'm going to show you a quick video clip. As you're watching, what did the procedure involve and what did she discover about praise?
We took 5th graders. We give them puzzles to solve.
So you see these blocks? Can you tell me what color is on that side?
Red, yellow, white, blue.
All right, so what I want you to do is put these blocks together so that the picture on top matches the picture here, all right?
First, we give children a set of easier puzzles to do.
Now here's the next one.
When these 9 and 10-year-olds successfully put together the puzzle, the children are praised for either their intelligence,
wow, you did really well. You must be really smart at these.
Or the effort they made.
Wow, you did really well. You must have tried really hard at these.
Then we give them a much harder set of problems, ones that they might, in fact, struggle with.
Here's the next one.
And we see what happens to their confidence. Do they think, oh, this means I'm not good at it after all? Do they stop liking the puzzles? Or do they maintain their confidence and think, well, it just needs more effort or strategies? What happens to their motivation?
Are you ready to go on?
Ta-da! We also ask them, well, which problems do you want to work on some more? Those easier ones or those harder ones? And generally we find that kids who have been praised for their intelligence really want to go back to those easier ones that were their claim to fame.
This is a sign of a fixed mindset, the belief that intelligence is innate and can't be changed.
What we found was that children thought that difficulty meant they weren't smart or they weren't good at the task.
So you seem to have more trouble with this one, and I want to know why you think that was.
Probably because I'm not good at these problems.
A very discouraging conclusion.
Other children show a growth mindset.
The growth mindset is like this. No matter who you are, you can always become a great deal smarter. They feel smart when they're working really hard on something difficult and making progress.
So if I gave you some more problems, would you like more problems like these that are pretty easy so you'll do well, or problems like these that'll be hard but you might learn a lot from them?
These.
More like these?
Students praised for effort generally want those hard ones that they can learn from. What I've learned.
So the procedure involved giving a bunch of fifth graders a task. These were easy tasks, all of the kids succeeded, and then they were given a follow-up task that was challenging, so all of the kids struggled. Then they were asked, which kind of task would you like to do more of? The kids who had received praise for their intelligence were much more likely to choose the easy tasks. The ones who were praised for their effort were much more likely to choose the more challenging tasks. And so, based on this work and many years of work, Dweck has determined that praising for intelligence is more likely to lead to a fixed mindset. Praising for effort is more likely to contribute to a growth mindset. And here's how I'd like you to end. I'd like you to reflect a little bit on your own life. Why do you think that you have succeeded or struggled to succeed in school? Reflect on your own experience related to the connection between intelligence and achievement, with a focus on one or more of the following: mindset and stereotype threat. Okay, thank you.